part of the volunteer team. And just to give you a heads up, there are two different sessions today. Session one, which you have just joined in for, is a section on evidence and truth, which will be led by Vrunda Pathare from the Godrej archives. There will be another session soon after that on copyright and privacy, which will be led by Divij, who will be coming in at about 11:45. So do stay tuned for that if you're curious about questions around ownership and privacy and such. And then finally at 8 p.m. tonight, we will have a session, a fascinating tale on the history, or rather the hunt for the virologist Dorothy Hamre, who was one of the original discoverers of a coronavirus strain in the 1960s. And Professor P. Balram, who most in the scientific community would be very familiar with, will be leading that discussion along with the archivists from the Northern Arizona University, who will be joining it at the bright early hour of 7:30 a.m. their time. So with that said, I hand it over to Vrunda. Over to you, Vrunda. Thanks so much.
Before that, I just have a couple of housekeeping rules to begin with.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah.
Not a problem. So I request all the participants to stay on mute and also switch off your videos. And I also request the panelists to mute their mics once they've spoken. And I'm sorry, it was from my end. Also, the interactions that follow after the panel, it's open-ended and it is dependent on the participants, but I request the participants to send in their queries on the public chat and not to the moderator. The chat box is also open for discussions, but I request it to be kept civil, minimum, and respectful when the speakers are presenting. And also there's an option called as raise hand. And so please make use of it and also lower your hand once your queries are answered too. So if you have any other technical technical queries, feel free to contact me. I will be Milli Network and I'll be able to answer them. So I think over to you, Vrunda. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Venkat, for actually inviting me to moderate this panel because, in fact, I actually accepted it because I'm curious really to know and listen to all these wonderful panelists. So it's like learning for me as well. So when I was asked to moderate this session on evidence and truth, I actually started thinking about the whole genesis of the idea of archives, which is framed around these two words. And around 19th century emerged the idea that true writing of history had to be based on a critical appraisal of, say, authentic or textual source material from the past. And the basis of this method was the belief that all history comes from facts retrieved from these first-hand documents. But then here is a catch, because even though we want to look at an archive as a, say, neutral repository of facts, we really cannot overlook the fact that through the archives, the past in a way is controlled by those who establish and maintain them. So certain stories would be marginalized and others would be privileged. So archives, have been always about the power, about maintaining power over information, maintaining control over information, what is and will be known about the past, or about the power of remembering over forgetting. So archives really represent this enormous power over the fundamental ways in which society really seeks the evidence of its past. And then objectivity really becomes the questionable notion because one needs to explore that whose truth are we going to represent. And these are the dilemmas that as an archivist, we always face while making choices of what is to be included in the archives or what is to be left out. And then even the silences in the archive started, speaking something. And today we actually have a wonderful panel that is trying to fill in these silences. And each one of them is actually trying to fill in these silences and making available multiple truths to the existing or even an absent narrative. I'll just quickly introduce the panel, and I'm sorry to inform you that Jayashri from Kamra could not join us today. So today we have three panelists who will present for 10 minutes and then we will open it for question answer. So our first speaker is Nandini Oza. She has worked as a social and political activist for over 2 decades in non-government organizations and people's movement like Narmada Bachao Andolan. And since 2004, she has been recording people's histories of the mass resistance against the Sardar Sarovar project on the river Narmada in Western India in form of oral histories of the people And now these are available on the website oralhistorynarmada.in. And at present, she is also the president of OHI. Our second speaker is Dr. Sanjeev Jain, who is a renowned clinician and heads the Molecular Genetics Laboratory at the Department of Psychiatry at NIMHANS, Bangalore. And he has been researching the history of mental health, and I'm really looking forward to these presentations. And he has archived more than 6,000 case notes from 19th and 20th century. He has also published 2 books on NIMHANS, which actually helps us understand the interface between science and medicine, and also social responses to mental illness. Our third panel is Dr. Alok Sarin. He is also a psychiatrist and mental health activist based in New Delhi. And he is right now consultant psychiatrist at Sitaram, Bhartia Institute of Science and Research. He has been member of the task force set up by Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India, to write a mental health policy of India. And Alok is also particularly interested in the history of psychiatry. So we have this illustrious panel. So now I would like to invite Nandini to present. Nandini, over to you.
Thank you so much, Vrunda, for such a nice introduction to the entire panel, and I look forward to it and the subject also. And thank you, Milli, for inviting me here on this particular session, which is very close to my heart, evidence and truth, because we come from the other side of the story. So I will present on this subject, taking an example over which I have been working for several decades now, more than 2 decades. It's about, I'll be giving the example of a very prominent struggle in the independent history of India, the Narmada Bachao Andolan, a powerful people's movement against a very gigantic dam being built on River Narmada in Gujarat. So that will be my case that I'll be presenting. So before I go to the project and the people's movement, I want to give you a little bit of a background about history after independence. There was a thrust for building large dams in the country as development models, for food security, providing water, power. So we had the Bhakra Nangal Dam, and in fact, Pandit Nehru, our first prime minister, called temples of modern dams as temples of modern India. So there was this big thrust, and one after the other, large dams on rivers started coming up at a great speed. And I believe that was the case across the world. And in 1961, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru laid the foundation stone of this particular dam in Gujarat, called the Navagam Dam at that time. It was much smaller, and as I said, dams were considered as temples of modern India. However, at that very point of time, the tribals in 1961 began their resistance because their lands began to be acquired. So while on one side the dam activity started, the foundation was laid, on the other we had in 61 itself the indigenous tribal people beginning to resist. However, the dam did not go up at that point of time because the governments wanted a much higher dam. There was a dispute between the party states because a much higher dam would lead to large-scale submergence in the adjoining states, and so the matter was referred to a tribunal. And after 10 years of deliberation, the tribunal, Narmada Water Dispute Tribunal, gave its award in 1979 and kept the height of the dam much higher than what the foundation was, at 455 feet. And this led to a massive resistance in the adjoining state of Madhya Pradesh, because this dam was to be built in Gujarat, but its main submergence was in the state of Madhya Pradesh, with large number of villages and fertile lands and forests. So in 79, there was a massive resistance in Madhya Pradesh. But by then, the dam work did not accelerate because environmental concerns began to grow in the country. There was a silent river valley project which was not taken up, and then projects began to be required to have environmental clearance. And this particular project was not getting clearance, environmental clearance. But then in the early 80s, the World Bank came into the picture, the international financial institution. It again gave a push to large dam, and it decided to fund this project even before the Ministry of Environment, Government of India had given clearance to this project. Most of the important studies had not been done, but the World Bank decided to fund it. So there came a speed in the construction of the work. And it was around that time, again, people realized that it is a reality now, the affected people. And the displacement number was very large is very large by this project. 245 villages, 2.5 lakh people in these villages are to be submerged and displaced. And equal number, 2.5 lakh, that is 5 lakh in total, 2.5 lakh by infrastructure development. So obviously people started coming together, because there was no official intimation. They were not involved in the whole decision-making process. They did not know what awaited them. And so initially they started asking, what about us? Slowly, organizations started to build around this issue. And it became a very big movement called the Narmada Bachao Andolan. And it began raising very fundamental issues that where are you going to rehabilitate so many people? Have the environment studies been done? 13,000 hectares of forest is to be lost and submerged. The Environment Ministry has listed 7 to 8 important studies to be completed. Where are those studies? Because those studies were not done, which included flora, fauna, fisheries, archaeological studies, because Narmada is a very rich and old river valley civilization. So archaeological studies had to be completed because that was going to be underwater. Downstream impacts, catchment area treatment. Slowly, the movement began to realize that the environment studies were not even done. Forget about being made available to the people, but they were not done. They were not completed. And in 87, in fact, the Ministry of Environment even cancelled the clearance to the project, the conditional clearance it had given. So, and then people started also asking the costs, the cost benefit analysis, who is to benefit, at whose cost, financial implications. And with the experts and the local knowledge and activists, the movement realized that what the government was projecting was based more on claims rather than facts and data and truth and evidence. It was more, this is going to happen and we are going to solve it. So the movement itself involved in a lot of studies, fact finding, and declared that we need a review of this project. Some independent commission needs to set up. The government can put its claims and data. We will present our claims and data on each of these, whether rehabilitation is possible, whether environment assessment has been done correctly, whether it can be mitigated, who are the benefits going to, whether they are really going to actualize or not, because we have found that in projects, mostly the benefits are overestimated and the costs are underestimated. So all these financial cost benefit analysis, and the movement became very strong around the demand of review of the project. The biggest breakthrough came when the pressure mounted and the World Bank had to set up a commission, independent commission, to review the project. It was called the MOSE Commission. It heard all the stakeholders, the government and the movement, Narmada Bachao Andolan, and it came as a big boost to the movement when the independent committee said that the World Bank will have to step back because both on environment and displacement count, the project studies also have not been completed. So when this boost came up, we were very confident that our data, facts, figures were very strong, and our demand, the movement's demand for the review became more powerful. So the government of India also then had to set up a review committee, independent review committee, which again invited all the stakeholders to present their evidence, facts, data, truth, everything about the project. But the government of Gujarat refused. They said, we will not participate in this independent committee, though it was set up by the Ministry of Water Resource, Government of India, because they said the tribunal award is final. Though the tribunal award had not studied any of these aspects, it was only involved with fixing the height of the dam and sharing of the waters. It had not looked into displacement in that great depth or environment issues. Gujarat government decided not to participate. That review report is out. Many of the findings of the Narmada Bachao Andolan were taken on board by the review committee set up by the government of India. But again, a big boost came when the movement approached the Supreme Court with all this evidence. And the Supreme Court took the matter on board And for next 5 years, it put a stay on the construction of the dam because it found very important reasons to do so based on the facts and findings presented to it by the movement of the people. When the final judgment came, so the dam work was stopped for nearly 4 to 5 years. And even when the judgment was delivered in the year 2000, uh, there was a split judgment. The minority judgment said what the movement was saying and said that the project needs to have a complete relook on environment and displacement issues, and you can't go on constructing like that. Even the majority judgment, while it gave a go ahead, put up several conditionalities because it found a lot of evidence and truth in what the movement was saying. So it laid down these conditionalities. And because of that and the movement, for another 17 years, the dam work could not be completed by the government because there was such powerful evidence with the movement. It got completed only when the Gujarat chief minister became the prime minister of the country, and the dam wall has been completed. The project still remains incomplete. The canals have not been built. So
Nandini, you have 2 minutes.
yeah, I'm just ending. So what is truth and evidence? I just will end with a slide. I just wanted to say that on one side, the government glorified the project, said everything, but we had so many review reports, even the court, even the committees appointed by the government endorsing what the movement has been saying. So what is truth and evidence? I'll just share a slide to conclude. I want to conclude by popular sayings in Africa, until the lions have their own histories, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Until the history of Africa is told by Africans, the story of greatness will always glorify the imperialists. And finally, what I wish to say is, in case of development models, unless the victims of development place evidence and truth, the development planners will glorify the project or the development model, often not supported by evidence and truth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nandini.
Have I stuck to the time?
Yes. So this is actually the website that you can log into, Oral History Narmada, to see the oral histories that Nandini had done since 2004. So you can just explore that. And thank you, Nandini, for this amazing presentation. So now I would request Dr. Sanjeev Jain to start his presentation. Over to you, Sanjeev.
Hi, so I'm Sanjeev. I'll be talking about the history of madness. Now, as we heard from Nandini, the voices of reason and logic and documentation are very, very important. And the most marginalized of all are people who literally have no voice and are often erased. That's the mentally ill. And psychiatry, as the truism goes, has a very long past, but a very, very short history. Every society has known madness forever, but the history of formal psychiatry I'm sorry, was I audible?
Yes, now you are.
So psychiatry has a very long past, but a very short history. So although society has known madness forever and forever, but even as a branch of medicine or as a branch of systemic social response to mental illness, it's a very short history. And within India, it is, of course, starts only in a formal sense in the very recent past. So madness or people with madness are the ultimate marginalized because their experiences themselves are not taken seriously. So leave alone their bodies, even their minds are erased from history. So understanding this particular group tells us a lot about what happens to these disorders. Let me try and do. Can you see my screen now? Is the screen visible now? Can you see the screen now, please?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah. So we'll be talking about this. So our particular interest is Mysore and Karnataka. So this is a painting from I think the Wellcome Archives showing the death of Colonel Moorhouse besieging the walls of Bangalore in 1793. And because of the British influence, we have doctors coming into practice by 1830. This particular doctor is born in Mysore in Srirangapatna, and he makes all these comments about life in Mysore somewhere around 1840. Climate of Mysore is more pleasurable. Indo-Britons, that's the so-called British, want both moral and physical energy. The disease of the Hindu are mild, and Brahmins and Hindus suffer from dyspepsia and derangement of the stomach. Cholera is very rare. So all these accounts of physical illness start accumulating. And over time, they establish a mental hospital. So by 1880s, there are lists of people admitted to the mental hospital. They include very many British names as also Indian names, Maniamma, Afros, from various backgrounds. There are a number of in the records of the 19th century, there are Armenians, Catholics, Irish Catholics, French Catholics, and Indian Catholics being admitted. On the right-hand side, you see the Karnataka State Archives records of these, the revenue earned from the sale of ganja and cannabis over several years in Karnataka, in Mysore state. And so therefore, drugs of abuse had a huge presence in the way the state was administered, which obviously has an implication for psychiatry. When the British left technically in 1881 and handed over Mysore to the local Maharaja, it went into some kind of decay, and there was inquiry into the malpractice at the asylum in 1904. But the routine work of the asylums continued all the way. So even in 1916, you get a request for improvement in the hospital by spending some few thousand rupees. The First World War happens, at which time the Indian doctors, who hitherto have not been allowed to get senior position in the medical service, come back from the war. And the winds of change are blowing all over the world. So the hospitals have to be renamed from lunatic asylums to the mental hospitals. And these are documents from the Prime Minister, Diwan Sir Mirza Ismail, to the Highness Sir Krishna Raja Wadiyar. The request is sent in on 27 September 1926, forwarded on 28 September and approved on 2nd October. So within a week, all these changes occur. And this is a particular aspect of life in Karnataka at that point of time. And our detailed history starts somewhere there, because at this point of time, Mysore is rapidly modernizing itself, independent of British India. So the Rockefeller Foundation steps in, and they foster the development of healthcare in Mysore Kingdom. So you have Dr. Sweet from Johns Hopkins, who's put in as the deputy in charge of health. And the League of Nations investigates as to why Mysore Kingdom is so much ahead of British India as far as public health is concerned. And that's where the records get even more interesting. So from Karnataka, we are able to archive case notes right from 1894 to 1947. We have almost 4,500 cases. And from then onwards, most of these have been transcribed. We also have collected state archives from the Karnataka government, which I showed you, and the private papers of various people from Frank Narona, Govind Swami, Murthy Rao, Vare Marma, Masani, etc., etc. Oral interviews have also been conducted to understand the formation of psychiatric care. From Tezpur, we have around another 4,000 case sheets, again going back from 1897, actual mentions of people admitted in 1876. So this is a fairly detailed archive of what kinds of things happen. So this is, for example, this is the very first case note that we have in the archives. A 25-year-old butler who's admitted with epilepsy and mania, has been admitted before. He's been discharged, has been readmitted several times. His sister has also got headaches. He keeps reciting from the Bible and is quite disruptive. So all these data has been put into an Access database, which can be searched online, not online as yet, but it can be searched. And it gives you a window into what kinds of people and what kinds of symptoms of madness come in. For example, this is a person who's paranoid about he's a municipal official and a local, whatever, well-known person. He's a vice president of the Sakhleshpur municipality, but he feels that people are against him and are trying to make him mad. And for that itself, he's brought to the mental hospital. So you get a fairly good cross-section of people. There's a schoolmaster from Bangalore who's admitted with a 1 month of history, saying that the headmaster has been noticing his audit accounts too carefully, and he might dismiss him because of his disproportionate expenditure, and he gets more and more paranoid. This is interesting because paranoid states were defined in Europe and Germany only in the preceding 10 years as having this kind of symptoms as was being diagnosed in Mysore. So you can see that the doctors in Mysore are incorporating so-called trends in Europe and England fairly rapidly in their day-to-day practice. Patients come in from all over the place. It is a very cosmopolitan area, as we all know. So this is a person from Chittagong who says he speaks English, French, Kannada, Tamil, Bengali, Hindi, Urdu, and French. And he's been smoking a lot of ganja. He's smoking a lot of cannabis, and he is in a state of mania. He recovers within a few weeks. But the idea that cannabis causes mental illness had been there in the 19th century. One of the commonest diagnoses in the British records was ganja insanity. But after the Hemp Commission of 1896, this became much less common. And now it's coming back. So you can track the coming and going of various diagnoses and social preoccupations. Ganja is sold, ganja is thought to be causing madness, and it does cause madness and things like that.
Sanjeev, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah. And the records extend all the way to Lahore. For example, these are records from Lodge Patch, who's trying to modify mental health services in the Punjab. And they note that lunatics' life is not a happy one, and how public in India is not very careful about how they treat the mentally ill. The records come back to the second half of the 20th century, which is what we are archiving now. This is an early record of the use of ECT. ECT itself has been used for the first time in India in Bangalore. And new machines have been developed within NIMHANS with the help of Indian Institute of Science. So they are completely indigenous technology ECT machines, and they are used fairly commonly. So this is the point that we are doing, that we are archiving and indexing case notes at various institutions. They'll be very valuable to track the accounts of disease and social factors in addition to institutional histories, which is what we all have been familiar with. At NIMHANS, by the time we end, we'll have about 45,000 case files. From Tezpur, as I said, 4,000. And we'll be documenting the way madness has been perceived. And ideas about madness have developed in this part of the world over the last 100 odd years. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sanjeev, for taking us through this journey of history of madness. Because when I used to work as a researcher at Bombay State Archives, I used to find these files on lunatic asylums in the general department. Right. And I often wonder that, what they must be offering, what they must be discussing. And this is really one glimpse that I got today. And I think we'll continue this thread. And I would invite Alok now to talk about his work. Yeah, Alok, over to you.
Thank you, Vrunda. Sanjeev, you need to unshare your screen. Yeah. Thank you, Vrunda. So, in continuation of what Sanjeev was saying, I'm going to be talking about the history of the mental hospitals. Yeah, let me just share my screen as well. Yeah, can you folks see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So, going from the individual to the institutional histories, when we started researching and started getting interested in the history of the mental hospitals, it was actually quite, I mean, it has for a long time, the history of the mental hospitals in India has been written and has been taken for granted. The mental hospitals in India are basically a colonial construct which was set up by the British, and they give a fairly detailed, sort of create a fairly detailed narrative. The way that we look at the hospitals or the mental hospitals or the lunatic asylums now is that they are spaces of exploitation, of desolation, of a sort of a uniformly gray picture where terrible things happened, and that, and this is the prevailing worldview, that the sooner the hospitals are closed down, the better it would be. When you start researching the history and sort of unpinning it from the ideological construct, then you bump into very many other things as well. So the first and most interesting thing is that there is a mental hospital, or there is a psychiatric facility in Delhi now, which is actually in a suburb of Delhi, which is Shahdara. They started around the late 1950s, the early 1960s, and it has for long been assumed that this is the first mental hospital in Delhi. When we started researching, however, we found that this was not true. So when we started looking at this, there is a magazine called the Imperial Gazetteer, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, which has maps of India from the early 1800s, from the mid 1800s. So this is a map of Delhi. It's too busy. I mean, I'm sure you can't see the screen. You can't see detail on the screen, but you can see that this is Delhi 1857. This is a close-up of one corner of the map. If you look at the left, again, it's not particularly clear, but if you look at it, and I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but this is where the insane hospital is located in 1857. Going on, this is a picture from a newspaper in London, the Illustrated London News. And again, if you can see where my cursor is, this area, and I'll just bring you a close-up of this area here, outside the walls of the city, is where the lunatic asylum and the jail complex are located. This is where, if you can see the smaller arrow and you can see my cursor, this is where Firoz Shah Kotla is. This is where the lunatic asylum and the jail complex are located. And if you read that little bit, are destroyed on the 11th of May in the year 1857. I'm not sure whether you recognize the significance of the date, but we will just come to this in a moment. So here is a monograph published by the Punjab government, which is a critical review of the Punjab mental hospitals by Major Lodge Patch, which Sanjeev was referring to. So the excerpt that Sanjeev was giving was, again, from this monograph. This is, again, something that we bumped into. And on page 18 of this, there is a little note which says that on the 11th of May, 1857, the whole of the insane patients, the language is that of Lodge Patch, insane patients at Delhi escaped or were set free and were never recovered. Now, if is the thought that I asked you to hold, I don't know whether you remember, but the significance of this date, which I'm sure has escaped no one, is that on the 10th of May, is when the mutiny starts. The mutiny starts at Meerut. By the 11th of May, the mutineers reach the outskirts of the city. The mental hospital is outside the gates of the city, outside the gates of the old city, of what the city was at that point of time, roughly where Maulana Azad Medical College is located at the moment. This is where the mental hospital is. The mutineers are coming down that road. This is the first Sarkari, imperial governmental building that they see, and they ransack it, freeing all the patients. The parallels with the sacking of the Bastille, which happened exactly 65 years before this, are too obvious and too gross for us to have missed the parallels. And remember, the Bastille, while it was a prison, was also a mental hospital. So the sacking, the ransacking of the mental hospital of Delhi is actually the first act of rebellion in the city, the capital city of Delhi, which is a fact that, we have starkly and startlingly missed all of these years. And maybe this is a time to start thinking about this. And, both by historians of psychiatry and historians of the mutiny, it's surprising that, that we haven't paid as much attention to this. But anyway, moving on from that history. So actually we've even, all the official histories have forgotten about the fact that there was a mental hospital there. And this hospital is ransacked in 1857. This hospital ceases to be a hospital. Sorry. Subsequently, other hospitals appear in Delhi, and we have details of those, but it's a long and complicated history. We don't at the moment have too much time, so I'm not going to go into those details. But interestingly, what happens is that this hospital is closed down. Another hospital is set up within the walled city. It runs till about 1865, 1866, when this whole discussion happens as to whether it is cost effective to run one hospital in a province, or whether it is cost effective to run smaller hospitals across the state or the province. Remember that at this point of time, Delhi is part of the Punjab presidency. So the major hospital or the capital or the big city at the moment at this time is Lahore. So in 1867, after a lot of discussion back and forth, and as to whether it makes good economic sense, whether it makes poor economic sense, or whether it makes sense for the individual, in 1867, the hospital that is running in Delhi, not this one that we're talking about, but the one which is running in the walled city, is closed down, and all 80 odd patients who are at this time in the hospital are shifted to the big hospital, which is in Lahore. And again, heart-rending stories and accounts are written about these people and the fact that, that these people will never see their family members again. Lahore, you must remember, at this time was geographically the same distance, much more difficult. Travel was much more difficult. Nothing much has changed. It still is the same difference. Geographically, the distance is the same. The distances in many ways are much more at the moment. But anyway, this hospital.
Look, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, so I will go on. There is a story about Ghalib, his life and his letters. and there is his brother, who at the times of curfew, which closely approximates the lockdown that we've been having till recently, his brother is suffering from schizophrenia, and he dies during the curfew. And he finds it very difficult to even find wherewithal for the burial. There are stories which emerge from letters that have been written, which talk about the mental hospital which exists at the time of the mutiny. So collecting archives from very many diverse sources, whether it is the maps, whether it is the mental hospital records, whether it is the letters of Ghalib, whether it is the book of letters which Mahmood Farooqi has written about the voices, the subaltern voices of people during the mutiny, we can actually piece together a fairly clear history of the mental hospital that exists in Delhi using those archival sources. We don't have too much time, so I won't go into too many details, but two more points that I would like to make is that this hospital closes in 1867. Everybody's shifted to Lahore. However, people fall sick and people need a place to get admitted. Another hospital is set up, and that runs till about the year 1900. In 1900, again, what happens is that the hospital is closed down again. 103 people are shifted to Lahore again, and they have, and Delhi then ceases to have a hospital. It's part of the jail complex till the new hospital is set up in what is now Shahadara. Very interestingly, the current hospital in Lahore and the hospital in Delhi are both, which have similar, though diverse trajectories, are both in suburbs of cities and both in suburbs which are actually called Shahadara. One last archival piece, which is a report from the Mental Hospital Lahore, which talks about the bifurcation of the hospital. This is the hospital from Amritsar, about the setting up of the hospital from Amritsar, but it talks about the people who were sent from Lahore. 282 patients were sent from Lahore, and 233 patients were sent from various hospitals across India to Lahore. The startling echoes between this real life story and Manto's story, which is called Toba Tek Singh, are again too many and too obvious for us to ignore. And clearly, there are many learnings that we have from here. I'm going to stop here and cease and open it up for discussion. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you everyone, and thank you all the panelists for bringing out these dislocated and displaced histories. And there are actually lots of congratulatory messages that are also flooding in. So there is one question for our first panelist, Nandini, and this is from Heather Goodall. Heather, are you there online? Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, if I can.
Yes, please.
You can see me, but I'm attempting to get myself visible. I'm not sure if you can see me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm just I'm wanting to ask Nandini, given there has been so much work done now to work in language with those people who are affected by the dams and bring their stories to languages like English, where people like me who are disadvantaged with Indian languages are able to read and hear about them, as well as to Hindi and mainstream Indian languages. Has there been an effect on the way general histories are being written either of Madhya Pradesh or of the dams?
I will have to disappoint you, at least not in my knowledge, not in the mainstream. But mainstream histories have started at least taking cognizance of the movements per se that this have happened. Earlier, we just used to have the dam builders history. So the more focus would be on the leaders of the movement. There's 1 or 2 line reference somewhere, you know, you would have Sundarlal Bahuguna or Baba Amte or Medha Patkar being mentioned, but reaching to the people affected and finding place in mainstream has not, at least to my notice, happened the way in which Dalit history has come quite a bit to the tribal history has not come in the mainstream so much. But it is beginning to get there. Not yet. No, not yet. And it's beginning to get there. In fact, independent historians and researchers researching on dams, I would recommend 2 very good books. I think both are in English. One is on the first anti-dam struggle, possibly in the world in the early 1920s against Mulshi Dam. It's written by Rajendra Vora, recently translated into English. So that's a wonderful documentation of the first anti-dam struggle in the country. So there are voices of people there, letters there. I mean, they're just testimonies, not histories as such. And the other book, which is very fascinating, is No One Had the Tongue to Speak. It's about the Morbi Dam disaster, you know, the collapse of a huge dam in Gujarat that in which hundreds of people lost their lives. It's on a Morbi Dam disaster. That has a lot of testimonies of survivors because of that. But other researchers have used people's voices as testimonies, but per se as history, I don't see so much of mainstreaming happening so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nandini. There are actually lots of questions about the history of the mental health, and Koina Tomar has one question for both Sanjeev and I think Alok. Koina, are you there online?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you ask your question?
Yeah.
Yes,
I
you
can
are.
ask
You
my
are.
question. Yeah. Hey, thank you so much for sharing those histories with us. I was just wondering, and case files are so important for historians of medicine. And I was just wondering how did all these case files end up in NIMHANS? Just a bit about putting together of that archive, some background on that. And are there plans to make them accessible digitally? What kinds of privacy issues come when you make cases, medical cases, available for sort of public scrutiny? And I also had a question for Dr. Sarin. So thinking about like about mental asylums, I was wondering what kinds of histories do you see of madness that are outside institutions, and especially in like those years of like 1840s, 50s, when Delhi is just kind of going through this huge turmoil? Are there also, because I was thinking of the book on partition that you co-authored, I was also thinking of like similar kinds of themes coming up in that mutiny struggles. If you could talk a bit about that. Thank you.
So I'll tell you about the Bangalore hospital or the psychiatric services go back to 1840s. So the case notes, and they had a fairly fixed administrative structure. So the actual registers show patients who were admitted way back in 1867. That's the oldest physical record that we have. But from 1901 onwards, there's a register which still exists. So you can document all these names. And at the end of the year, they're all totaled up and they're carried over to the next year and new admissions are made. So you can actually follow these records till the person dies or is discharged. From 1920s, once the Indian doctors start getting trained specifically in London, and the whole imperial processes are made more uniform. So the same forms are to be filled up by mental hospitals, whether it's in Bangalore or Lahore or Kenya or Nigeria or West Indies or even America. Identical records have to be kept. So these are all stapled and kept together, and these physical case notes go back to 1923. And the hospital opens around 40 to 50,000 case notes a year, and they still exist as paper records. So in total, we have in the hospital around 1.2 million case notes at this point of time. And so we are archiving stuff only till 1970. The history of it is therefore, the privacy issues are obviously quite complex. So we, in India, we do not have a 100-year rule for making medical records public. We don't have any rule at all. So right now they are searchable to scholars, by scholars who can come to NIMHANS and work on them. And we are still working with how to make at least some of them anonymized and devoid of any biographical location history. But that would also take away a lot of the actual historical importance of these records. So it's a difficult thing that we are dealing with, but we hope to do that. Well, madness in Delhi, of course, is a very interesting thing. Nicholson, who led the British march to Delhi and the siege of Delhi, starts out his march, and at that point of time, he's confronted by a madman, by a person who says that the British should leave India and leave India to the Indians, and the British have no business being here. And he shoots him dead. Nicholson shoots him dead. And the others tell him that these ideas of independence are a very common delusion these days. So the idea of independence of India first starts as a delusion in the mind of a madman rather than anything else. Alok?
Yeah, I'm just unmuting it. Thanks. So I think Koina Tomar asked the question, right? So this is exactly what we are trying to do, So there is, a big thing about history is that very often, and this is the point that Nandini was trying to make perhaps in a different way, is that history or the writing of the histories is as much influenced by ideological position. If I'm trying to look at everything that is wrong with the mental hospital, if I'm looking at the bleak desolation of the mental hospital, that is what I will see. If I'm just looking at what it is that is happening, then I will see perhaps a much more complex and different story. So one part of the history is the hospital itself, the institution, what happens to the institution, where does the institution go? The other part of the story is what happens to the people in the institution. Because as Lodge Patch writes and other historians write, there were probably around 150, between 150 to 250 people in the hospital in Delhi. In May 1857, this hospital is ransacked. None of those people are found again. What happens to those very real people? None of them. I mean, there are some sketchy reports that 11 or 12 are found, and this forms the nucleus of the other hospital that is running in the city at this time. We know from Mahmood Farooqi's accounts of the letters that there is a hospital running, because the letters do talk about a baker who has run away from the Pagalkhana and the police is trying to send him back. He's refusing to go back because he doesn't want to go back, but there are no rotis being made in the mental hospital. So there is a mental hospital running. Who is running this hospital? What is happening to those people? We don't know, but there is a hospital running at this time. Ghalib, who is probably amongst the privileged few who is living at the same time in the city of Delhi, has a completely different account to offer us. His brother is being cared for at home. It has never, probably occurred to Ghalib to access the state mental health facilities. Again, the parallels with today are startlingly obvious. If, as a person of privilege in Delhi, I fall ill today, am I going to go to the government facility? Am I going to the private facility? What is my reality? Which hospital will I access? Which hospital will have me? Ghalib doesn't even consider the possibility of going to the state hospital. His brother is being cared for at home over decades. During the curfew, the brother's family has to leave. And I don't know whether you know about the details of the curfew, but Hindus had to leave for a month, Muslims had to leave for 2 months. And there was a staggered sort of, I mean, again, between the unlockdown and the lockdown and the ways that the unlockdown happened, alternate shops will open, alternate. All of this has happened in various forms before in the very real world that we live in. The circumstances may be different. Human beings, the societal systems are pretty much the same. Our responses are pretty much the same. So Ghalib doesn't even consider this. So there are different pieces of this tapestry, if you will, that we can sort of patch together. It is far from complete, but different textures will obviously emerge. I don't know whether this answers your question, but yes, there are many different sources for this.
Yeah, so there are actually many questions, and I would request everyone to keep their questions brief. So Bharat, are you there online? Hello, Bharat? Okay, actually he has a question that, so he asks that how was the madness thought about and dealt with socially in the pre-colonial era? And are there any suggestions of European ideas about madness entering the subcontinent? He also has a sub-question where he talks about whether women figure in these records and if you can talk about feminine subjectivities. So.
Documentary evidence of any institutional care for the ill in any form prior to the colonial era. Neither the Ayurvedic nor the Mughal systems allowed for public spaces as common goods to exist. So there were no common hospitals and there were no common welfare services. Everything was driven by religion and caste and by feudalism. So the idea of a building which served as a hospital was fairly new. There are historical anecdotes of there being hospitals in the time of Ashoka and of a mental hospital in Mandu under one of the small kingdoms that emerged in the central Indian provinces. Women patients are quite prominent in the archives. They're obviously just 60-40 or ratios at best. Women are often under parda, so they access the medical services much less. And there is a big stigma against putting women in hospitals in general, which is why women's hospitals are one of the first to be set up by the British. But interestingly, diagnosis of hysteria, of grief, of dowry harassments, of alcoholic husbands, all these figure in the records, in the case notes of the women patients, as also syphilis and abuse and things like that. So there's a fair amount of detail. So I hope that answers the question. You have to unmute.
Yeah, so there is another question by Tanya Sharma. Tanya, are you there online? Hello?
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so can you ask your question? Yeah.
Ma'am, actually, I'm not. I just want to know from Sanjeev sir. I already sent him question.
Yeah, I can see that. Right. So should I answer that? See, the correct data, I have no idea. We have the data that we have. So I don't know how correct or incorrect it is, but we don't get any particular evidence that there has been a kind of whitewashing of the data. This data is compiled fairly routinely every time a person is seen, and then they are added on. Now, the handicap issue is a bit trickier because till the early 20th century, the so-called mentally handicapped were also put into mental hospitals. And at some point in the early 20th century, they stopped coming into mental hospitals. Whether this is accompanied by another facility for the mentally handicapped, we have no idea because they simply don't exist even now. But we do notice that the mentally handicapped stopped entering the asylums sometime in the early 20th century. The rates of recovery in Indian mental hospitals, as the British themselves point out, are much, much better than in Australia, Canada, or England itself. And about 2/3 of the patient are taken back home. And this capacity of the families to treat the hospital as a short admission, as a short kind of care service, after which they go back to their homes, is something that continues till now. So they are pretty revolving door. Only about 10 or 15 patients stay over every year. So about 20 or 30 years down the line, they become overcrowded. But typically, it's a revolving door. People come in, recover in about 4 to 6 months or a year, and then they go back to their families.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah, so I think can take 2-3 questions, right?
I can see a question by Heather to Alok.
Yes, I can see
Yes,
that question as well. And the answer is, we have no idea. The question for everybody, is why did the mutineers ransack the hospital? We have no idea. There are no accounts in the voices of the mutineers. It is recorded in the institutional history that the hospital is ransacked on the 11th of May. The significance of this date by the recorder is not noticed or is not commented upon either. Neither Lodge Patch nor the mental hospital record comments on the significance of this date. But the inference is far too obvious for us to miss. And what is truly startling is that this connection is not been made. But we have no idea. We have no idea why they did this. I mean, we are presuming, and it is speculative, that if the mutiny starts on the 10th of May, on the 11th of May, if the hospital gets ransacked just before the city is attacked by the mutineers, the connections are far too obvious to miss. But we have no account from the mutineers, or if there were, they have been lost. We are hoping at some point of time, if they exist, they will be found, and we would welcome them. But at the moment, it is purely speculative.
But there's just a little addendum to that. In the 1950s, there was a particular British doctor who tried to be very strict with the patients and employed something called token economy. They had to work, and if they worked, they got more money, and the food rations were reduced, and violence was often used. The inquiry committee actually castigated the doctor. So whether some of these patients who had recovered and had gone home had told other people about the cruelties inside the mental hospital, and it's just a simple expression of anger, is a much more mundane reason, that the reputation of the mental hospital was not exactly covering itself in glory at that point of time. But as Alok says, it's highly speculative. We have no actual evidence, except that this inquiry committee in the early 50s says that there's unnecessary miserliness on part of the superintendent. So that's about it.
But again, it's a complex story. Yeah. You see, the fact is that token economy was being used. One person is found guilty of using unnecessarily harsh measure, but this person is castigated. This person is called out, and the token economy system is stopped. Yeah. So there is a system which goes wrong, which goes out of sync, but there is a self-correcting mechanism as well. So in those stories, there are many layers of stories, and I think we have to perhaps record all of them.
Yeah, there is another question by Malini Krishnakutti. Is she there online? Malini? Okay, I'll just then read out her question. So question is again regarding the mental hospitals. So she's asking that, are setting them up the responsibility of municipalities today, or is it set up at the state level? And is the state withdrawing from its responsibility of mental health post-liberalization and there are new hospitals for mental health being set up nowadays. So is there a steady decline since colonial times is what her question is.
Alok, you first. Or?
Yeah. So the fact that there are they both coexist. The fact that there is a state presence, those hospitals exist, and there is a very large private sector which is also part of this, and that in many ways current regulations try and bring both into the ambit, are very real. There is within the gamut of health, where does mental health care figure? What are the thinkings about health care as a whole, and how does this affect mental health care? Are questions that we have to think about, which perhaps have not really been addressed as well as they should. The fact remains that mental health care facility, both the availability of beds for admission and the sort of facilities that exist are woefully inadequate, is not and should not be in a doubt in anybody's mind.
And I just add, India has around 20,000 mental hospital beds, 20 to 25,000 beds in mental hospital, so-called long stay beds, which has remained unchanged from the time of independence. Most of these, about 15% of them, around 6,000 people, are so-called long stay who have been there for more than 5 years. But the total population is around several crores, and we expect that there are about 2 million people who need beds at any point of time. The number of beds in psychiatry has not increased. The services have not increased. And basically, the government has shown no interest in making mental health, especially of the chronic disabling conditions, being available to anybody. So there has been a retreat of the state completely as far as long-term provision of care of a life of dignity is concerned.
Thank you, Sanjeev and Alok. Malini has also a question for Nandini, and she is asking that she believes that post-independence, the extent of displacement due to large projects is in the tune of 50 to 60 millions. And could Nandini throw some light on any archival efforts and projects that record the stories of other displaced persons?
A very important question. I just want to give the mental makeup as to how we consider displacement by development projects. You know, unlike political displacement like partition or the displacement of Kashmiri Pandits, displacement for development projects, be it dams or mines, is considered necessary. It is considered important. It's a sacrifice you make for nation building. So in fact, we do not even still have the right numbers of people who have been displaced. Forget about keeping a proper record or having them. Having said that, you know, movements have themselves made some efforts. So there are testimonies that have been submitted to tribunals or courts. So you have from the Pathare Dam, you have some from the Bhakra Dam, Narmada, of course, we are building an archive. Mainstream still continues that this displacement is necessary for nation building, and so we don't even have the right numbers. But across the world, we have the World Commission on Dam that took on board, you know, to try and measure the number of people displaced across the world by just dams. In fact, in India, we do not still have the numbers of people displaced by dams. Total number, it's an approximate estimate by different studies. So this is the condition. But some important movements also across the world have done their own archiving, like the Pakmun Dam. They have even set up a museum of the ecology lost, the fish variety lost because of the building of the dam. Because flowing water, when it turns to reservoirs, so they have a museum actually. So these are all, you know, efforts done here and there, and you have to piece together. Otherwise, it's not available, and I'm sorry to say that.
Yeah, thank you, Nandini. Actually, because of the paucity of time, I'm going to club two questions. There are two questions pertaining to partition. So Upasna Devi wants to ask Sanjeev and Alok that could you tell a bit on the changes to these facility due to partition? And there is another question that is from the YouTube actually. So it says that it will be interesting to know if Manto's iconic Tobatik Singh is actually based on some actual event of transfer of patients. So could you just tell us about?
Second one is fairly simple. It is. So that's all there is to it. So Manto had a fairly close awareness of life in a mental hospital. He had been admitted once in his own life.
Right.
So there is a fairly, there's been a recent paper analyzing Manto's biography and its psychiatric overtones published, I think, in London. So there is, so that fact is quite obvious. The condition of the hospital in Lahore gave rise to, the partition of the hospital in Lahore gave rise to many, many consequences. All the patients who were admitted had to be transferred to India, but India itself was not unified. The only hospital under the imperial control, which was transferred to the powers that be in Delhi, was Ranchi. So many patients were sent all the way to Ranchi, and only Punjabi patients were kept on in the so-called Punjab. And since there was no hospital, they were housed in tents for a while. And then I think Alok can give the details. Another disused building, which was a postal or a leper's home, was converted, and all kinds of ramshackle things were done till a new hospital was built sometime in the mid-50s, and that's the Amritsar Mental Hospital now. Alok, you can probably supplement that.
Pretty much. And
pretty much
see, you must remember that before 47, the history of mental health care is the history of the mental hospitals. There was nothing outside of the mental hospitals that was happening. What we see as psychiatric care or mental health care, general hospital psychiatry, it all happens later. So the hospital in Lahore is divided. All the non-Muslim patients are sent to India, as Sanjeev says, part of whom stayed in Amritsar. Delhi doesn't have a hospital at this time. And they are sent, Ranchi has two hospitals. The provincial hospital, which is now which was earlier the Indian mental hospital. Ranchi had two hospitals, the European hospital and the Indian hospital. So they are sent to the provincial hospital, the Indian hospital in Ranchi. And in answer to the other one, Sanjeev has already answered. Mantu was admitted twice actually to Lahore Mental Hospital before he died. And again, the parallels are so clearly obvious. It is that fact is actually stranger than fiction. What we've taken to be as a product of Manto's obviously fertile imagination, and which is true in so many startling and dark ways, is actually based in fact.
Yeah, thank you, Sanjeev and Alok. I just wanted to check with the organizer if we have time for taking like 2 questions, or shall we just wrap it up?
Can we wrap up with one, Vrunda? This is fascinating. I think we could go on this, but
yes,
just in the interest of the other panelists who are waiting in for the next session to start.
Right, right. So shall we conclude then, or shall we take one?
I leave it to you.
Okay. No, there is actually one question that has come up is regarding actually describing these kind of records in the archives, especially related to mental health. And it says that idea of an independent India first emerged in the mind of a madman. And this person wonders how such stories can bubble up from the archives on their own, and how the keywords and categories can describe such archives, and if any speaker can walk her through the mental process that results in such inferences. So anything that you can talk about designing such platforms and how would you be annotating these, so.
I leave that to you, professional archivists and museumologists. I won't have the foggiest. I really won't have the foggiest.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a pretty larger a question, but I think that needs another discussion panel, I guess. So yeah, so I think those who I couldn't address the questions, I think they can ask them personally and they can chat with these speakers later on. So I think it was a really wonderful panel about these displaced histories that came about.
I think, Govinda, I think a small comment is required. Madness, independence is not madness. The fact that delusion or that the beliefs of people who are suffering from psychiatric illness is a real thing. Psychiatric illness is not a figment of imagination. Psychiatric illness is a very, very real thing. The beliefs of people who are suffering or experiencing psychiatric illness will be influenced by what is happening in the world around them. This is something that we need to understand. So madness is not, or independence is not delusion. Sanjeev is being partly provocative, partly stimulative when he says this. Do not take him literally when he says this. So, and I think that we must make it clear. And you see, because if we think of madness as a figment of one's imagination, the whole edifice falls through. The fact is that all these stories are real. And I think both the respect of the experience and the reality of the experience have to coexist. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alok. That was, I think, this is the note that I think we should conclude on. So I think over to you, Venkat, if you want to address. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks so much, Vrunda. Thanks, Sanjeev, Alok, and Nandini. This was absolutely riveting. I think I'm going to go back to the YouTube at some point and just catch on it. There was just one last comment from someone in the audience who asked for your contact email addresses. So I would leave it to you to drop it into the chat window if you so desire, or some way in which they can get in touch with you regarding these histories. We will now take a 10-minute break and we will get back here just before noon, let's just say 11:55, to start our discussions around copyright and privacy. And I think those questions are very closely tied to the points that Nandini, Sanjeev, and Alok have raised in their conversation. So I do hope you stay tuned for that. For that, we will have Divij, Anubha, and Srinivas, and I really look forward to this session. This will be an informal discussion with all three of them, where they will first sort of lay the landscape of copyright and privacy, and then we'll go into specific questions that people will have. But for now, thanks so much, all of you. Thanks for being here, and please stay on for the next session if you have the time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello. Hey, Divij.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly do a tech check and see if everyone's audio and video is working fine. Srinivas and Anubha are on the call.
Yeah, they're all co-hosts, so all of you should be able to share your screen. You can just test it out one after the other.
Right. I don't think Anubha, Srinivas, do you have any presentations to share? So will you be needing screen sharing functions?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
No.
Anubha?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, who all are on this session? Divij, Srinivas, and
Anubha.
Anubha.
Sinha.
Yeah.
Great. And can you
hear me properly, because I'm a little away from the mic?
yeah, now we can hear you clearly. The first thing you said was not very audible.
Right, so I'll be louder. Thanks.
Right. And can we just share our videos as well and see if it's working fine? Can you, I hope you can see me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, can the two of you also just briefly share your video? Thank you.
Yes, that works.
That's fine. Srinivas?
I'm a little low on bandwidth. I can turn on video. I'm on 4G.
Okay.
If it doesn't work, I'll turn it off.
That's fine. Not a problem. And Padmini, in case you need to jump in, I'm sure you've already done the tech check.
Hi, Divij.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah. So, so very briefly, I just wanted to go through also for the tech team and the people handling the questions. We'll for about like maybe 35 to 45 minutes. Anubha, Srinivas, and myself will briefly be discussing on very specific questions. I'll start with a 10 or 15 minute background on why archivists should be concerned with these two specific categories of the law, particularly copyright law and privacy law. And I'll move on to kind of ask questions of Anubha and Srinivas based on their experience working with archives and the law. So that should take, about 35 to 45 minutes. And then we'll open the floor for questions and discussions and general conversation with everyone who's participating. So for the questions, do I need to look out to the chat specifically, or will somebody be fielding questions from the tech team to me to direct them towards me?
So Divij, there's a Google Doc, and Nived, who is in the room along with me, are sort of populating that doc. From time to time, we'll send you those questions on chat, and you can also click on the link, which I'll just send you.
All right. Yeah, that Google Doc would be.
But it'll also be free and flowing on the chat. So you'll have one eye on that box anyway. But just in case you miss something on the doc, you'll see it in red.
That's fine. So just to clarify, I'll be moderating and kind of taking the questions and directing them, right?
I think so.
That's fine.
Right?
Yeah. You're steering this discussion. Yeah.
Wonderful. So yeah, that's about it. Anything else, Anubha, Srinivas, any specific question?
No, nothing specific from me. I was just thinking that I would like to sort of discuss, expand on the legal concepts that you will probably bring up a little, if necessary. And I will try to focus on my experience with working with the archives.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if right after this I should present my law and policy recommendations. I think I leave it up to you, Divij, to see if there is a good time or a good question to sort of bring that up.
Sure.
Thanks.
Looks like Srinivas dropped out, Divij. There might have been a bandwidth issue. So next time he comes in, you could just ask him to be on audio or something like that.
Sure, I'll do that. So Anubha, we'll start with you to kind of take forward the discussion on copyright. And then we'll move on to Srinivas to kind of discuss the data protection issues. Is that fine?
Yeah,
but I'll give an overview of both laws in the beginning itself, so there's a more clear flow.
Perfect. Thank you. Hi, Srinivas. How are you? It's been a while.
Might still not be here yet.
Yeah, I think he's dropped out.
Do you guys have his contact? Do you want to just reach out to him or something?
Yeah, I'll just check with him. Yeah, my messages also aren't going through. That's strange.
Divij, do you want to call him just to check what's going on?
Yeah,
Before the session starts.
ನಿಮಗೆ ಉಸಿರಾಟದ ತೊಂದರೆ, ಜ್ವರ, ಕೆಮ್ಮು ಅಥವಾ ನೆಗಡಿಯಂತಹ ಲಕ್ಷಣಗಳು ಇದ್ದರೆ ಆಪ್ತ ಮಿತ್ರ ಸಹಾಯವಾಣಿ 144110ಗೆ ಕರೆ ಮಾಡಿ. ಕೊರೋನಾ ವೈರಸ್ ಸೋಂಕು ಹರಡುವುದನ್ನು ನಿಲ್ಲಿಸಬಹುದು. ಹೊರಗೆ ಹೋಗುವಾಗ ಮನೆಯಲ್ಲೇ ತಯಾರಿಸಿದ ಫೇಸ್ ಮಾಸ್ಕ್ ಬಳಸಿ. ಇತರರಿಂದ ಕನಿಷ್ಠ 2 ಮೀಟರ್ ಅಂತರವನ್ನು ಕಾಪಾಡಿಕೊಳ್ಳಿ. ನಿಮ್ಮ ಕೈಗಳನ್ನು ಆಗಾಗ ಸೋಪಿನಿಂದ ತೊಳೆಯಿರಿ. ಭಾರತ ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ಆರೋಗ್ಯ ಮತ್ತು ಕುಟುಂಬ ಕಲ್ಯಾಣ ಇಲಾಖೆ ವತಿಯಿಂದ ಜನಹಿತಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ಜಾರಿ.
Divij, what we could do is you could just drop, well, actually, if Srinivas's contact or something to one of us, we can do that while you start moderating this conversation, just to get things going along.
Sure. When are we starting approximately now? Are we ready to start?
We're ready to start, but
okay. I'll just Srinivas, are you having some trouble logging in?
Yeah, my network isn't working. I'm trying to step out and join via mobile.
Okay.
That should be online, right? Right?
Okay.
If not, just let another join. Anyway, I'm going second, right? I'll join.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
See you. Great. Srinivas is having some network issues, but he's saying he should be able to join in about 3 minutes. Right.
Okay, perfect. So I just wanted to welcome everyone to the second session of this morning, day 4 of the Milli sessions. This is a section focused on questions related to copyright and privacy, particularly from the world of the archives. And absolutely thrilled to have Divij, Anubha, and Srinivas here to sort of take us through some of these questions. And I'll hand it over to Divij to take it forward. Thanks, man.
Thanks, Venkat, and thanks for inviting me and for putting this together, everyone. It's been a really fascinating few days of discussions, and in fact, just the last discussion when everyone was speaking about health records and stuff got me really, I was thinking a lot about many of the issues that I've been, and both Anubha and I and Srinivas have been thinking about over the last few years, considering the use of the privacy implications of various forms of records that we have, various forms of personal information, and how Indian law hasn't really adequately dealt with it. But as I understand, these are not issues that are particularly new to archival practice or archivists and historians. They've thought, about the ethical, moral dimensions of this for ages, right? About how to make restricted material more public, how to give access to that, how to preserve that. And similarly for kind of, the intellectual property side of all forms of works and records. People have always thought about how to attribute certain forms of ownership to the people who have created these records or the people to whom they pertain. So as such, these are not discussions that should particularly strike anyone as new or something very, very surprising. But I do think that there's a striking gap in law and policy in how at least we as lawyers or policymakers or lawmakers think about these issues, right? Particularly in India, I think there's a significant gap in recognizing the role that archives play in the preservation of, memory for the public interest. And because of that, our kind of law, our legal resources haven't really kept pace with the work that archives do, particularly in the digital age. So the idea behind this session is to get some, to have a conversation with everybody who is on this call, as well as, this specific discussants, to kind of talk about how the law thinks about archives, how archivists think about the law, and how they should be thinking about the law, and also to kind of invigorate maybe some of the people on this call who are interested in these matters to more seriously take up the idea of how the law can help archives and how it's currently restricting the works of archives. I think there's much to be done from the policy side in terms of petitioning to the government or making it more clear what needs to be done to improve the works of archives. I'm going to start off this session by giving a very brief overview, and this is going to be one of the toughest things I've done in a while, to give an overview of two major fields of law in 15 minutes, but I'm going to try that, and specifically how it might relate to the work that everyone on this call has been doing, and archivists and historians and so on. We'll then go on to ask Srinivas and Anubha, who are on this call, to introduce themselves, and also to give a brief overview of their experiences dealing with different aspects of the law and archives. In fact, I think we can just do the round of introductions right now, although Srinivas has been having some trouble logging in. Right. I'm Divij Joshi. I'm a lawyer, an independent lawyer, and a technology policy researcher. I'm currently studying artificial intelligence and policy, which is a very broad way of saying that I'm looking at data privacy and the kind of decisions or the implications that machines and computer systems have on our lives. I'm also a Mozilla fellow for this year, where I have a grant from the Mozilla Foundation to work on these issues. I'm also a associate director at the Spicy IP blog, which routinely covers aspects of emerging intellectual property